Good morning, Ms. Pappenheim. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
And obviously you can see me, I think. Let me tell you who you're talking to. You're talking to a number of people here in Fleetbank House. There are some lawyers, there are a number of members of the public, and myself and Ms. Richards will be asking you the questions. But you have a wider audience beyond this room. It'll number about 200 or so who will be watching remotely throughout the day. You're at home, I think?
Yes.
And your partner is in the house, but not in the room?
Correct, yes.
Now, Mary will ask you to take the oath, and then Ms. Richards will ask you questions.
Please state your full name.
Karin Pappenheim.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely.
I do solemnly, sincerely.
And truly declare and affirm.
And truly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Ms. Pappenheim, can you see and hear me?
I can, yes.
Now, you became the Chief Executive of the Haemophilia Society in March 1998, and you held that role until April 2004.
Correct, yes.
Your background was one of working in national voluntary sector organisations at that time.
That's correct, yes.
And you were also a trustee of the National Council for Voluntary Organisations 1999 to 2005, and of the Terence Higgins Trust 1998 to 2003.
Yes.
You've referred in your statement to having learnt that there had been a historic relationship between the Haemophilia Society and the Terence Higgins Trust, dating back to the earliest days of the appearance of the HIV virus. What was your understanding of the nature of that relationship?
What I'd understood is that in those earlier days, there were, as far as I'm aware, there was no formal relationship, but the two charities, THT and the Haemophilia Society, were both in their different ways responding to the impact of the virus that was then very new, and that there was some communication and collaboration between them. But as I was not there at the time, I only knew that from what I was told. But I think both those charities were very active in trying to respond to an unprecedented situation where individuals were being infected and falling ill.
When you took up your post as Chief Executive and in the first stages of your work there, what did you know about what had happened to people with bleeding disorders treated with blood products and their infection with HIV and hepatitis C?
When I first came into the role, and when I was originally interviewed for the role, actually I feel that I didn't know much about what had happened. And as I recall, during the actual recruitment process and the interviews with members of the trustee board, who were all people with haemophilia affected by what I learnt from that recruitment process, what I think was probably fairly new to me at that time. And I was so struck meeting those individuals, hearing what they told me at that stage. That was a very big part of my motivation in wanting to join the society. But as far as I can recall, as a relatively well-informed layperson working as a CEO in the health sector, I feel I didn't know very much, but I was immediately struck by it, and that is probably the first time that I became aware, I believe, of what's been often called one of the biggest disasters in the history of the NHS. So it was incredibly powerful to meet individuals from the society, and I wanted to join them in their campaign.
Now, I'm going to ask you to look at a couple of documents that talk about some of your early priorities. Shomik, could we first of all have WITN 4504003, please? This is one of the Haemophilia Society's bulletins. It's 1998 issue 2. We can see that at the top of the page. And if we go to the third page, we can see it says introducing, and then we have your name set out and an explanation that you've been appointed as Chief Executive of the Haemophilia Society earlier in the year. And then if we go down the page a little, please, Shomik. We can see you set out what you're going to be concentrating on. So it says, Karin said, working with the Haemophilia Society will be a challenge, but one that I relish. I will be concentrating on the campaign for recompense for people with haemophilia infected with hepatitis C through their NHS treatment. It is a scandal that they've received no financial support from the government. And then it records that you were also keen to address the issue of prescription by postcode, where the availability of the best treatment depends on where you live rather than on clinical need. And you refer to there being already a dialogue with the Department of Health on that issue. What was it that led you to focus in this early part of your employment with the Haemophilia Society on those two issues?
Very much at that stage, as an incoming CEO, I would be responding to what the trustee board had led me to understand were the priorities for the organisation. So the campaign was very high priority. There was no doubt about that from the recruitment process on. The campaign was high priority. The campaign had already been running for a number of years before I joined, and it was clearly a very, very important issue for the whole Haemophilia Society. It was made absolutely clear to me by the board that this is the priority, and indeed I think it was within the first week of my appointment, I was straight into a meeting at Westminster on this particular issue, to make the case for recompense for people with hepatitis C. Obviously the treatment issues were there as well. So it's quite a full agenda of healthcare issues to be addressed for people with haemophilia all over the country. But top priority was very much pick up the campaign now and provide, as the CEO, the leadership that's needed, reporting to the trustee board.
And then if we look at WITN 4504005, we'll see a document headed Chief Executive's Priorities, July-December 1998. So this is for the second half of the calendar year in which you joined. If we go to the next page, please, Shomik, we can see under the heading Public Affairs a number of priorities identified to take the lead role in society's current campaigning activities, specifically HCV and recombinant, and we'll come on to that in more detail in a little while. Maintain active programme of external relations with government, its advisors, politicians, opinion formers, other organisations. Review our campaigning activities and identify future issues for action, e.g. recombinant factor 9, women with bleeding disorders. Decide level of presence at party conferences. Maintain/rebuild formal links with key partner organisations, i.e. UK HCDO, nurses and other patient groups. I'm going to ask you in a lot more detail about the campaigning work, but broadly speaking, this was obviously, I a table put together to plan, but were these the principal elements of the public affairs work that as Chief Executive you then undertook over the following years?
Yes, it's a summary, and it's would be very typical of the way in which, as a professional CEO, I would agree priorities for my work with the trustee board. So this is a summary of key areas and priorities. And as you can see, the public affairs work takes its place within the whole document with other priorities that had to be included in the role as well. But it's in order to be clear between Chief Executive and board as to my priorities as CEO, where I should be focusing, how I should be spending my time, and of course it also then allows for planning. As you can see, there are timescales, and there would be regular reporting between me and the board at every meeting as to how I'm progressing, how the work is progressing on these priorities.
Although we'll come on to some of the detail of the campaigning activities in the course of the morning, in broad terms, did your views as to the appropriate direction of travel for the Haemophilia Society ever conflict to a significant extent with the views of the Board of Trustees?
No, I don't think so. During the 6 years that I was there, obviously there would be debates and discussion on particular issues. Often as CEO, I would prepare a discussion document, and I think you will find copies of those within the Haemophilia Society archives. I might prepare a briefing document, and I think there are some in the materials prepared to support my evidence, but ultimately the decision had to be taken by the trustee board. My role would be as CEO to provide advice, expert advice, to provide guidance, but the decision would need to be taken by the board. And sometimes these were very, very difficult decisions to take, and no easy answers to be found. But there may be times when my personal view might have been different, but I can't recall a specific example.
I want to ask you a few questions next about the organisation and structure of the Haemophilia Society and matters relating to membership. And we can take that down, thank you, Shomik. When you joined the Haemophilia Society and having had experience in other voluntary sector organisations, what, if any, impression did you form about the way in which the society was organised and structured?
So from a formal point of view, obviously the charity's memorandum and articles of association form the structure, the legal structure of the charity. From a governance point of view, the trustee board, as would be expected, is the governing body of the charity. So that is as I would have expected it to be. Like all voluntary organisations and charities, there will be ways in which governance can be improved. And you'll see in the priorities document, which we just looked at, that one of my priorities was to take a look at the governance and see how it might be improved. But that would be what I would expect of any well-run charity, is governance can always be reviewed and improved. But it had a structure which was, I would say, not unfamiliar to me, because other charities that I've been involved in leading and managing also have a membership and an election process and so forth. So that's the structure that I found. There was also a structure of local groups who were branches of the charity in governance terms. Again, not an unusual structure to find in a charity. So that was there. And of course there was a membership. So all of that was within the memorandum and articles set out, the legal governance structure. And I think that's probably, as I've already said, very typical of a charity of this kind.
So is it right to understand the evidence you've just given as in this way, that the society was, you didn't have any particular concerns about the way in which the society was structured or run? You thought there might be room for improvement, but that would be typical for any chief executive coming into a voluntary sector organisation.
That's correct, and I would absolutely expect that as an incoming CEO. I think the previous CEO might have left, I can't remember precisely, but possibly a few months ago, so that would require attention, really, that noting that there hadn't been a CEO perhaps in post for a little while.
Your statement refers to wanting to bring more diversity of skills or experience onto the Board of Trustees. In what respect did you think that greater diversity of skills and experience was appropriate?
That, I think I've said in the written evidence, was very much a theme in the voluntary sector of trying to ensure that charities have a balance of skills, experience and perspectives on their board. So the thought process that was going on there, and the reason for thinking about that, was that it was very much a topic across the whole charity sector. So looking at the board as it was clearly very strong in being made up of representatives of the haemophilia community, affected people, relatives of affected people, and the additional balance, if you like, might be to bring people with different perspectives, different professional backgrounds into the board. There's a lot being written and is still talked about and written about achieving a balance of perspectives on a trustee board, and that diversity on boards is a good thing to have. So that was the origin of thinking that way, and I guess also as a trustee of Terence Higgins Trust at the time, I could look at that and see that was a similar discussion and thinking and rationale going on there. So yes, it was to achieve a broader mix, more diversity, and perhaps some different perspectives.
Now, if we just look at a paper you produced in mid-1998 in terms of committee structures, it's at HSOC 0024114, please, Shomek. We can see it's a report to the Trustee Board meeting for the 18th of June 98, implementation of specialist subcommittees. And under the heading background in the first paragraph, we can see that there's a broad proposal for replacing an existing system of task groups with a reduced number of subcommittees of the board. And we can see the purpose of that change set out, including to more clearly focus the aims and objectives of such groups within the framework of the strategic plan. And then if we go over the page, we can see, I think that you're proposing that there should be 3 subcommittees: an information and communication subcommittee, a health subcommittee, and a resources committee. And I just want to ask you just a little about the health subcommittee. So if we scroll down the page a bit further, please, Shomek. We see it's proposed that the remit of the health committee would be blood and blood products, HIV and hepatitis C and other infections, both information and policy issues, health policy generally as it may affect the interests of people with haemophilia. This subcommittee's role will be to consider latest information and research in relation to haemophilia treatments, health services, infections, and formulate policy recommendations to the board as appropriate. It should also keep a watching brief also on developments in health policy generally, such as changes in the NHS, and have the lead role in determining the Society's policy on specific areas. It will function as an information forum, ensuring that the Society is up to date with current knowledge and practice in relation to haemophilia and other bleeding disorders. For this committee, it will be essential to have among the members one or more individuals with medical knowledge, as well as awareness of current health policy and NHS management issues. Now, first of all, was this proposal put into effect, that there became a health subcommittee with this remit?
Yes, it was.
And were you able to include amongst its members individuals with medical knowledge?
Yes, and I know in the documents that have been provided here, there are some minutes of health subcommittee meetings, I believe, so you'll be able to see that. Also in minutes, I believe, of the trustee board, you'll be able to see the board appointing the members of the health subcommittee.
Other than through having as amongst its members one or more individuals with medical knowledge, how was it envisaged, or how did it work in practice, that this committee would keep up to date with current knowledge and obtain relevant information about, in particular, HIV and hepatitis C?
Well, it was a very, very complex and changing healthcare field at the time. So there was a huge amount going on in health policy. There was a great deal going on evolving knowledge and science, treatment issues regarding HIV and hepatitis. All of these were evolving. Scientific knowledge was moving on at the time. And in order to keep up to date with all of that, it was necessary to make sure that we had individuals who would have that knowledge and would bring that knowledge together. So as a group, cumulatively, if you like, the membership of the health subcommittee, we hoped would bring that very broad spectrum of knowledge, awareness, understanding. Bear in mind that the individuals, if you were to look at the membership, each of those individuals in their own professional arena would have needed to keep up to date. It would have been part of their professional knowledge to keep up to date with these issues. So that is how we were hopeful that the health subcommittee would ensure that we had latest information, as it says here, keeping a watching brief. And when you do look at the minutes of the health subcommittee, I think you'll be able to see the evidence of what a wide spread of topics they were discussing there.
And then if we look at the next page, under the heading Other Issues, it tells us that the new subcommittee system has a clear function linked to the Board of Trustees and the Board's overall responsibility for agreeing policy and strategy. The subcommittee should provide centres of expertise on specific areas which will inform the Board's work. So was the structure that the subcommittees would effectively report to or make recommendations to the Board, but the ultimate decision-making on policy, strategy and the like remained in the hands of the Board?
Absolutely. And again, going back to the governance and the legal governance framework of the charity, the responsibility rests with the Board of Trustees. And it's made very clear, you can see it in this document, it's made explicitly clear that the role of subcommittees is to make recommendations to the Board, and the Board will be the ultimate decision maker. And again, I would say that is very typical of what you would expect in a charity governance structure, that subcommittees may have delegated responsibility for monitoring and providing intelligence and recommendations on these areas, but ultimately they must be accountable to the Board. Their recommendations go to the Board, and that, as it says in the document there, the Board has the overall responsibility for determining policy and strategy.
And then if we just look at the third paragraph on this page, we can see reference in the second paragraph to some existing task groups which provided a more informal think tank. And then the recommendation in the third paragraph is that the Chief Executive should review the need to maintain one or two such advisory panels or think tanks, which would be made up primarily of people with experience of haemophilia, not necessarily trustees. Such advisory panels would be brought together on an occasional basis by the Chief Executive and would not have a formal link to the board. What happened in relation to that recommendation? Were such advisory panels or think tanks retained in the years that you were Chief Executive?
I can't precisely recall whether we did do that or not, I'm afraid. At the time, I believe, my recall is that prior to my joining, there had been a great many think tanks and perhaps too many task groups and think tanks. And the idea was to try and streamline and focus. So I guess we'd have to really look at the documentation to find out. So at the moment, I can't really recall whether we did.
And then we can see in the fourth paragraph reference to reviewing the role of the medical advisory panel. And so we'll look at another document in relation to the medical advisory panel. It's HSOC 0023999, please, Shomik. And we can see this is a report to the trustee board meeting for the 25th of March 1999. It's authored by you. And we can see you set out in the first paragraph, it's been some time, well, it is some time since the membership and function of the Society's medical advisory panel has been reviewed. Indeed, the panel itself has not met for at least 2 years. Given that the various subcommittees of the board have been reviewed and reconstituted in the last year, it seems appropriate and timely to review the medical advisory panel and its future role. It's important that the role of the health subcommittee is taken into account in this process to avoid potential duplication of effort. And then you refer in the next paragraph to having met with many of the current members and that the panel was being used on an ad hoc basis by staff when queries about particular treatments or medical conditions arise. If we then go to the next section, so you pose the question, is there a continuing role for the MAP? Looking at the current membership of the medical advisory panel, so this is paragraph 2.1, almost all have roles within the UK HCDO and are comprehensive care centre directors. There's an absence of nurses, of clinicians who are experts in HIV, HCV, hepatology, or other non-haemophilia specialisms, or of professions allied to medicine such as physiotherapy. Equally, there are no members who are drawn from smaller haemophilia centres. And so you suggest in paragraph 2.2 that membership of the MAP could be expanded to include a more representative spread of expertise. As far as you can recall, Ms. Pappenheim, was that undertaken? Was membership of the MAP expanded to try and get a broader range of expertise, as you'd suggested here?
Yes.
And then in paragraph 2.3, you then say this raises the question of the function of the medical advisory panel. Essentially, as the name suggests, its role should be advisory. As a patient organisation working in a complex medical field, it is appropriate that we should have the broadest range of medical expertise on which to draw in our work. However, whilst the MAP might be asked to advise on particular issues, the responsibility for formulating and making policy decisions would remain with the Chief Executive and trustees. And you give an example in relation then to recombinants. And then if we just look a little further down the page, 2.4, you say another role of the MAP would be to keep the society in touch with developments in the field, although you say that that's to some extent covered by the Health Subcommittee. And 2.5, a further key role for the Medical Advisory Panel would be to comment on publications produced by the Society so that we're confident in stating that all publications reflect best medical opinion at the time. And then you identify the essential difference between the Medical Advisory Panel and the Health Subcommittee was that the latter has a role in formulating policy recommendations to the board and is an important part of the Society's governance systems, The Medical Advisory Panel, on the other hand, has no formal role in our governance and would function solely as a consultation forum. From my informal consultation with existing members of the Medical Advisory Panel, it appears that one of the difficulties in the past was that it was not clear whether the Medical Advisory Panel was a decision-making body for the Society. And then you refer to an expectation that they wouldn't meet more than twice a year and it would function largely as a virtual panel. Other than as set out at the top of that page about one of the difficulties in the past being a lack of clarity about whether the MAP was a decision-making body for the Society, were you aware of any other particular concerns about how the Medical Advisory Panel or any of its individual members had taken decisions in the past, or the extent to which they'd influenced the Society's actions in the past?
No, I was not. I've stated in my written evidence that when I produced this document and in my role as CEO, I didn't undertake any form of look-back exercise. So I didn't look at the past. It wasn't what I was focusing on. My focus was on looking at whether there was a role for the MAP and how we would utilise a reformulated MAP in the future. But I didn't do any sort of look back to answer that question. Obviously, I can't recall today, but in writing this, I must have been aware that there were past difficulties, but I didn't do any kind of analysis or look back exercise to find out what those were. So I can't really give any more detail on that background. It provided context, if you like, that I had an understanding that there appeared to have been difficulties, but I don't think I knew specifically what. And so the whole focus really here is on making it very, very clear what the role of the MAP would be in the future, and that is all stated in the documentation.
And were the recommendations which you set out in this document effectively then implemented, so that the MAP over the years that you were Chief Executive performed the role that you've described here?
Yes, I think so. I think that's true.
You've mentioned, we can take that down, thank you, Shane. You've mentioned in your written evidence, and there are references to it in the documents, that the Society had a hepatitis worker and an HIV worker. Don't need to consider them by name, but in terms of their roles and responsibilities, what in broad terms were their roles and responsibilities?
In very broad terms, their respective responsibilities were to do with providing support, and bearing in mind that major role of the Haemophilia Society is to provide services for affected people, and that's across the whole haemophilia community. So as a charity, primary remit to provide support and services. So the role of those two individual workers was to do that, but with specific focus on those affected with HIV and those affected by HCV. And in that capacity, I think you can see a lot of evidence of what services they were involved in providing. But it could be a range from organising support group meetings where there'd be peer support and opportunities to provide information and advice. They were involved in producing publications that would specifically be helpful to individuals who might be co-infected or hepatitis C alone. They had a role in answering individual queries, so part of the Society's service remit was to offer a helpline and information line so they could be involved in individual queries. So it was also part of their remit to be an identifiable point of contact for individuals who were affected by hepatitis and HIV. And you'll see in the bulletins, pretty much every bulletin lists the staff members. So it was very important to make clear there are identified individuals here. There's someone you can contact if you're affected. And that, I think, was a very important way in which the society was showing that we were there to support all members of the haemophilia community, including those who'd been infected.
Now, can I just then ask you a little more about membership of the society, so the society's members and their views and interests. First of all, if we could look at HSOC 00296989_029, please, Shomek. You'll see if we look at the top of the page, these are entitled Notes from a Trustee Board Away Day, held on the 27th of November 1999, and you're one of those present. And if we go to the bottom half of the page, we can see under the heading 3, Organisation Issues, Membership, still many people with haemophilia not members. How can we promote the benefits of membership more positively? Is the society truly a needs-led organisation? Is there more we should do to tap into the needs and views of people with haemophilia? And then there's a reference to the role of groups. Dealing first of all with that first point, still many people with haemophilia not members. Did you get a sense during your tenure as Chief Executive of how representative the Haemophilia Society was in terms of its membership, of the breadth of people with bleeding disorders?
I think we had within our membership all sorts of people affected by haemophilia. So within our membership, we had all age groups. So we had young people. We had a children and families worker addressing the needs of young people. We had the parents, and very important part of what we did was to engage with parents and young people. We had older people. We had, obviously, as I've said, people who had hepatitis and HIV. So across the membership, I think it would be fair to say that the membership represented the spread and the diversity of individuals with haemophilia, because looking at the life experience of those who are young, it might be quite different from the older members. And the society's membership certainly did include, I think, all of the people in the community, but it didn't include every single member of the community. So I hope my answer is clear in saying that as a spread across our membership, I think it's fair to say that membership included all of the different facets, if you like, of the haemophilia community, but not every person with haemophilia was a member. That's really what's highlighted there, like any membership organisation, and I've been involved in many, many membership organisations over my career. I think every one of them has to recognise that not every person who could be a member is a member, and that's really what we were addressing. Is there are still many at the time who weren't yet members, and we would have liked them to be.
And did you ever gain any impression of the extent to which your membership included, to a significant extent, those who had mild or moderate bleeding disorders, as opposed to those who had severe bleeding disorders?
I don't think I have the recall to be able to answer that question. And I am not sure whether we would have held that information. So there's obviously a question there about the amount of information that the Haemophilia Society as a charity would hold on its membership. And there are data protection issues, which probably not relevant to go into, but the question would really come back to how much information the Haemophilia Society actually held on our database at the time about members, and I am uncertain as to whether we would have had that information at the time. So I think that's really all I can say about that.
And then just picking up on the third point, is the Society truly a needs-led organisation? Is there more we should do to tap into the needs and views of people with haemophilia? First of all, to what extent did the Society in the years that you were there tap into the needs and views of its membership?
I would say we did that a great deal. So we often consulted members on specific topics. We had opportunities, as you'll see, we held many meetings of all sorts involving our members all over the country at different times. So we were very actively involved in meeting with and being with our members. So we had lots of opportunities when we were meeting with our members to hear from them, to discuss with them, to be able to hear their issues, their concerns. We obviously had meetings. We had our local groups that were another opportunity to connect with the membership and to hear what their concerns and issues might be. And of course, we also had the information and helpline, which is a very important source of understanding because people would be contacting that helpline. Staff would provide a report on the helpline about the numbers of calls and inquiries, the topics that were coming in. So I think we had numerous different ways, and the principle being expressed there, being a needs-led organisation, is really expressing here is a charity that is very much wanting to engage with the community, act to find ways of learning from and responding to all of the members of the community, the haemophilia community. And I think we were able to do that in so many ways, which I hope this answer has illustrated.
The Society itself was based in London and obviously had to be based somewhere. How did the Society ensure or try to ensure that the voices and interests and views of all its members across the United Kingdom were heard and understood and factored into its decision-making processes?
I suppose if you look at the local group structure, we had in the order of, I think, 25 local groups all over Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So we had those local groups which were very much in their remit a group that was local and representative in that sense of people living in that locality. We had the local groups, we had meetings which we organised all over the country. So as CEO, I was very frequently travelling up and down Scotland, different regions of England, Northern Ireland, having meetings. Sorry, I should have said Wales as well. So very much part of my role to go out with trustees to meet with the local groups. We also had a system in place whereby there was a link between the local groups. Each local group had a link person on the trustee board. So the intention was to make sure that there was always a connection. There was a named trustee board member who could be identified as the one with the link to specific groups. So I think we went to extraordinary lengths to be an organisation that wasn't London-centric, and that we got out, we travelled. I personally spent an awful lot of time travelling and being away from London, meeting our members, and that was a very important part of us as an organisation delivering on our remit to be truly national.
And we can take that document down, Seamus. I want to turn now to the Society's campaigning activities, Ms Pappenheim. There are three areas of campaigning I'm going to ask you about, and I'm going to try and take it in a chronological order so that we look at the documents chronologically, both to see what the Haemophilia Society was doing and to see what the response of government was at various stages. And the three areas I'm going to be asking you about is the campaign for financial assistance for those infected with hepatitis C, the campaign for a public inquiry, and the campaign for recombinant. Is it right to say that during your time as chief executive, those were the three of the principal campaigns, if not the principal campaigns, at different stages and with differing degrees of emphasis that the Society was pursuing?
Yes, I think so, although as I've also said in my evidence, there were other campaigning activities going on, but yes.
And I think an example of other campaigning activities was in relation to raising issues about availability of treatment for hepatitis C and of postcode lotteries in relation to interferon and ribavirin and so on. Is that right?
Yes, postcode lotteries, exactly that, access to latest treatments. Sometimes, potentially, I think I've mentioned in my written evidence, there would be situations in which clinicians were letting us know and patients were letting us know that funding constraints were delaying access, for example, to knee replacement surgery. So we might become active in that particular trust area to advocate for what had to be a more cost-effective thing to do, is to provide the surgery for that individual so that they could potentially get back to work rather than to leave them in a state of pain and disability. So there were those kind of localised campaigns as well.
Now, before we look at or pick up the chronology in 1998 when you came in as chief executive, I just want to look at one document from 1995 by way of background. It's HSOC 002295, please, Seamus. So you'll see this is a bulletin from 1995, so it's 3 years before you joined the Society, but we can see it's headed Hepatitis C campaign now launched. The Haemophilia Society has launched a campaign for government help for people infected with the hepatitis C virus. We see reference to the Reverend Tanner speaking at the launch of the campaign, and then we can see the campaign objectives set out. More equitable treatment in financial terms between those people with haemophilia infected with hepatitis C through contaminated blood products and those infected with HIV through contaminated blood products, specifically an across-the-board ex gratia payment to all those infected with HCV through contaminated blood products, access to a hardship fund for those who become ill and the dependents of those who die, as a matter of urgency, payments to those who are already ill and the dependents of those who've died. And then there's reference in the following 3 bullet points to other aspects of the campaign, so improved resources in terms of research and treatment and education in relation to hepatitis C. Does this reflect your understanding of what the objectives of the Society's hepatitis C campaign had been, when you came in 1998, to try and achieve an ex gratia payment, access to a hardship fund, and urgent payments, including to the dependents of those who died?
So when I came in 1998, the specific wording and formulation of the campaign objectives that you've got here, which obviously were 3 years prior to my joining, those were not the specific words that were in front of me when I came into post. And I think that's reflective of the fact that there were, at various times along this very, very long and protracted history of campaigning, there were different formulations of wording about what the campaign objectives would be. So just to be clear, when I came into post, whilst those specific words that are up here, which belong in 1995, were not the ones in front of me, what was very clear was that the top priority was to be identifying, to be focusing on the hepatitis C campaign, which was defined at that time as a campaign, I think, for recompense. And that probably it will be clearer to see what the campaign aims were in my day, in looking at my own evidence, because this is obviously prior, as you said, this is prior background. But what it does demonstrate is that the campaign, the hepatitis C campaign, was very, very active and had been running very actively for several years prior to my joining the organisation.
Let's pick things up then in 1998 when you joined the organisation, and we'll go to WITN 4504003. So we looked at this bulletin earlier because it had the passage referring to your appointment. So it's the 1998 bulletin, issue number 2. If this time we look on this page at campaign update, moves to put the hepatitis C campaign back onto the government's political agenda have had some success. The Society's attempts to put the campaign into higher gear have been boosted by 2 developments: an all-party meeting of MPs in April and a debate in the House of Lords at the beginning of June. At the all-party meeting, which was well attended by MPs, it was agreed that a delegation of MPs would ask to meet with the Secretary of State for Health, Frank Dobson, to impress upon him the urgency of the need for government action. The MPs, led by Roger Godsiff, have now written to Mr Dobson, awaiting a date for the meeting. And then we can see, if we go further down the page, reference to a debate in the House of Lords called by Lord Morris. And then the Society will continue to put pressure on the government, and there's reference to a proposed lobby of Parliament in July of 1998. It's right, I think, and we picked this up from later documents, in terms of the timeline, the Society had met with the Secretary of State for Health, Frank Dobson, in September of 1997, so before you joined. And at the point at which you joined, we're still waiting for a decision on the request for the government to provide some form of financial recompense. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And so is it right to understand what's set out here as the Society's attempts to try and keep the pressure on the Secretary of State for Health?
Exactly so, because already it had been months and months and months since that meeting. And so we wanted, as it says here, to put the pressure on, and obviously holding a lobby and making that very visible, attracting, we hoped, lots of media coverage and interest from within Parliament. Our whole intent was to address the delay in a response from government and to make this cause highly visible and to put the pressure on for a decision.
You maybe a difficult question for you to answer, but can you recall whether the MPs referred to there, the delegation of MPs, did achieve a meeting with the Secretary of State for Health?
I cannot recall. No, I mean, I guess there will be records of that somewhere as to whether that took place or not, but I cannot recall today.
And we saw, obviously, from the previous document that the campaign in relation to some form of payments for those infected with hepatitis C had been launched in 1995. So at the point in time at which you arrived, it was a campaign that had already been ongoing in some form or another for 3 years. Can you recall what, if anything, you were told when you joined the society about how that campaign had been functioning?
I can't specifically recall what I'd been told, but I guess really what's important is that when I joined, there was a huge momentum and energy for the campaign, as this document on screen shows. So there was a tremendous sense of I speak from my experience that the society had recruited a chief executive who had experience in advocacy and campaigning and in this kind of political activity. And the focus on me was absolutely, let's get on with this, let's move forward, let's put the pressure on. And I think, as I've already mentioned, I was literally within the first week into a meeting with MPs. I found myself then speaking and advocating at Westminster. So just, I think what I'm trying to convey is that the focus for me and for the organisation was on, let's move forward, let's bring energy, momentum, let's really step up this campaign. So I don't recall any particular focus in my own mind at the time about the past. That's my recollection today, and I think that's probably reflective of me coming into the role and wanting and being it made very clear to me we must move forward. So looking backward and thinking about what had happened before wasn't really, I don't think that was very much in my mind, and I haven't any recollection I can share with you today about what the past might have been.
And just sticking with this document, although on a slightly different issue, if we go to the 3rd page, please, Shomik. See there the heading Section 64 grant. If we just zoom in on that. The Society has been informed by the Department of Health that its Section 64 grant for people with haemophilia and hepatitis C has been reduced by approximately £88,000 compared with last year. This is particularly disturbing at a time when the government is apparently dragging its feet over a decision on whether to provide financial assistance to people with haemophilia infected with hepatitis C. The Society has written to the Secretary of State for Health to protest at the reduction and urge government to restore the funding. Karin Pappenheim, the Society's chief executive, said this is a blow for the Society and means that we will be extremely hard put to continue to provide the full range of services currently available for people with haemophilia. You talk about the difficulties that will create. Just look at the letter that I think you then wrote to the Secretary of State to protest about this cut in funding. It's at HSOC 00142556, please, Shomik. So we can see it's dated the 26th of May 1998. It's from you. You're writing to introduce yourself as the new chief executive of the Haemophilia Society. But in the second paragraph, we can see your particular reason for writing. My other less positive reason for writing is to express the Society's profound shock and disappointment at the reduction in our Section 64 funding from government this year. And you go on to express concerns about what the impact of that might be. If we go over the page, By way of example, you talk in the first main paragraph about having begun to identify new, hitherto unmet needs amongst young people infected with hepatitis C. You describe them as a very vulnerable group, and you give some further information about that. First of all, Ms. Pappenheim, can you just explain to us in very broad terms what a Section 64 grant was?
This was Section 64 was a government term, a civil servant's term, for a category of funding, Section 64, which would be used to support charities. So it would be widely known at the time in voluntary organisations as a Section 64 grant would be a form of funding which a charity could receive, I believe, but I haven't got absolute precise recollection, that potentially Section 64 funding would be of the type that's usually called core funding, that might support the costs of running a charity, or potentially it could be for a project. The reason it would be so important, any charity would regard a Section 64 core funding group category of funding as really important, because core costs of a charity are always very hard to fundraise for, and so covering the core costs and receiving a core grant would be really essential, as the letter spells out here. It was such a huge cut in funding at a time when the need for service was increasing and growing.
Can you recall if you were ever told the reasons for the government's decision?
This is purely my recollection, so I do not believe that any specific reason was given. And I believe that it is a possibility that government across the piece was perhaps reducing funding in this area, but we protested. Obviously it was very, very important, but I don't remember being told this is why it is being reduced.
And can you recall if you received a response from the Secretary of State for Health to your letter raising these concerns about the cut in funding?
I cannot recall. I hope that we did, because clearly this is a very urgent and important issue that I was writing about. It's possible that the Society holds a copy of the response, but I'm afraid I can't remember. I do hope they replied.
Can I then just return then to the issue of campaigning? I'll just look at a couple of documents really as an aide memoire as much as anything. So if we go first of all to HSOC 40313, we can see this is a memo dated the 31st of March 1998 to all members of the campaign group. So that's, as I understand it, the campaign group within the Haemophilia Society that was working on this particular campaign. And it's in relation to a meeting with MPs due to take place on the 1st of April 1998. If we just look at the heading, the case for recompense, Karin Pappenheim, it says you're going to summarise the case for financial recompense, who is affected, how they were infected historically, and then talk about the medical, psychological, social and economic impact of the virus on individuals and families. What kind of information did the Society hold, or had it gathered for the purposes of the campaign, about the medical, psychological, social and economic impact of the virus on individuals and families? Can you recall?
Well, it is a very broad spectrum. So I would say that our one source of information would have been the Society's direct contact with individuals. So direct contact with affected individuals would give the society knowledge and understanding of, for instance, the psychological impact. How is that affecting an individual's mental health? Social and economic impact, we would have had direct experience of that in terms of members making us aware that due to the impact on their health, they may no longer be able to work, they may have lost employment, they might find themselves on benefits. So we had our own direct knowledge and experience from our own direct contact with members, but of course at the same time there was a vast amount that was already written, I would say. For example, in the medical area, there would be publications, scientific and medical publications, which would be describing the medical impact of hepatitis C. So I hope I'm making clear that as a membership organisation and a charity, we had the opportunity to tap into, if you like, the direct lived experience that would give us a very strong sense of how this was impacting individuals. But of course, we also had access, as anyone else would in this area, to the scientific publications, all of the published evidence. So we would have used those to draw on. And also just to add that periodically we did carry out different surveys to find out directly from our membership about impacts. So we had numerous sources, and much of that was already, because this document that you have on screen was produced, I think, a week before I joined. So there was a lot that had already been written and put down on paper about this. I hope that makes clear that there was access to a great deal of evidence that could be used to support the case for recompense under those headings.
Now, the meeting with MPs went ahead on the 1st of April, and it was one of your first tasks, I think, as Chief Executive to join that meeting. If we just go to HSOC 0026345. We can see this is a letter you wrote the following day to the MP who had hosted the meeting. You say you found the discussion most helpful and encouraging. We've written to all the MPs present, advised them that your office will be coordinating the proposed approach to Frank Dobson. And then you refer to ensuring that the group is fully cross-party. Just wanted to ask you really about the extent to which, over not just at this point in time, but over the following years of your tenure at the Society, was the political support that you did have for the campaign very much cross-party support, rather than it being a party political issue?
Oh, it was definitely cross-party, and from the point of view of the charity, very important for the charity to work in a cross-party method. So it was very important to the charity not in any way to be aligned with any particular political party. So from a charity governance point of view, it'd be essential to demonstrate always that we are working cross-party rather than from any party political stance. Obviously, the other issue from a campaigning point of view, in order to achieve effect and impact, the broader the spectrum of support, the more power to our campaign, because this was so much an issue that was not party political. It was an issue of great importance, which we wanted to ensure was supported by all parties. So yes, wanting to ensure that it was fully cross-party was our objective, absolutely important. And I think that we would have to look at the detailed records and documentation for the time, but I think you'll be able to see that there were members of the different parties who were involved in supporting the campaign.
And then perhaps before we break, just one further document, HSOC 40307. This is a report to members of the Hepatitis Campaign Task Group from you. It's dated the 13th of May 1998. It sets out the various initiatives proposed over the coming weeks, the House of Lords debate. If we go further down the page, petitions, lobby to Parliament. And then there's a reference towards the bottom of the page, meeting with civil servants, April the 27th. At this meeting, we were assured that the Secretary of State was fully briefed and that no further information was needed from us to assist his deliberations. They are still unable to say when the answer will be forthcoming. Now, this would, I think, probably have been your first meeting with civil servants, given it's 27th of April 1998 and you'd only been in post for a month or so. Appreciate I'm asking you about meetings that took place over 20 years ago. Do you have any recollection of that meeting or of the stance of officials within the Department of Health to the Society's campaign and its requests?
I can't remember it, as you say. It was 20 years ago. So I really can't add any more to that. I guess, you know, what you can see there is probably the most accurate statement that can be made about what happened on the day. Our motivation was to find out why we still hadn't had an answer from the Secretary of State. So we were asking the question, is there any more information that we can give? We were looking to understand why the delay was continuing. As you can see there, apparently they were unable to say. They didn't want any more information, clearly, from us to assist the deliberations, but they were unable to say when the answer would be forthcoming. So I'm afraid from memory, I can't add any more to that.
So I note the time. Is this a convenient moment for a break?
Yes, we'll take a break now until 11:45, allowing you to just have a break and have some refreshment if you would like. You can talk about anything you like during the break to anyone, but you can't talk about the evidence you have given or may yet be asked to give. I look forward to seeing you back at 11:45.
Thank you.